In September 1943 at Rabaul, the sprawling Japanese naval air base carved into volcanic highlands overlooking New Britain's St. George Channel. Intelligence officers spread reconnaissance photographs across a wooden table in a briefing room where tropical heat made everything sticky, and where the walls bore maps tracking American movements across the Pacific and veteran Zero pilots, men who'd flown combat since Pearl Harbor, who'd shot down dozens of Allied aircraft, who represented the elite of Japanese naval aviation, leaned forward to examine images of America's new carrier fighter, the Grumman F6F Hellcat. The photographs showed an aircraft that seemed fundamentally wrong to eyes trained on Japanese design philosophy. It was massive, appearing nearly as large as some light bombers, with a broad fuselage housing an 18-cylinder radial engine, thick wings that sacrificed elegance for strength, and an overall weight approaching 6 tons when fully loaded with fuel and ammunition, nearly double the weight of the Mitsubishi Zero they flew. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, who'd survived combat since the first days of war and whose experience made him one of Japan's most respected fighter pilots, examined the photographs with the other aces and someone laughed, made a comment about American engineers building a flying truck, and others joined the laughter because the Hellcat's bulk seemed to confirm what Japanese pilots had believed since the war began, that Americans didn't understand fighter design, didn't appreciate that agility and maneuverability determined air combat outcomes, didn't realize that any aircraft unable to outturn a Zero was already dead regardless of what other capabilities it possessed. The cultural confidence in that room was built on genuine achievement. Japanese naval aviators had dominated early Pacific air combat, had destroyed Allied aircraft in ratios that sometimes approached 10-to-1, had demonstrated that pilot skill combined with superior maneuverability created advantages that heavier, less nimble aircraft couldn't overcome, and the Zero, with its extraordinary range and turning ability and climb rate, had become legend among both its pilots and their enemies, had established doctrinal assumptions about air combat that seemed confirmed by every engagement. The Hellcat in those reconnaissance photographs looked like proof that Americans still didn't understand, still thought they could win through industrial strength and firepower rather than through the refined grace and tactical superiority that Japan's naval aviation represented. And so those veteran pilots at Rabaul examined the images and believed the Americans had built the wrong airplane for the wrong war, believed that these heavy fighters would be easy prey once Japanese pilots exploited their obvious weaknesses, believed that American carrier forces equipped with Hellcats would suffer losses similar to what earlier American fighters had endured, and they couldn't have been more wrong, couldn't have understood how completely the aircraft they were mocking would destroy Japanese naval aviation within months, couldn't have imagined that within a year the Hellcat would achieve kill ratios that would reverse everything they believed about air combat, and their laughter at Rabaul would be remembered as the moment when Japanese confidence became fatal overconfidence, when tactical excellence blinded them to strategic transformation, when they failed to recognize that war itself was changing in ways that made their advantages irrelevant. The early Pacific Air War had been catastrophic for American naval aviation, had demonstrated with brutal clarity that pre-war assumptions about fighter design and tactics were dangerously wrong when tested against Japanese aircraft and pilots who'd been honing their skills in combat over China since 1937, who possessed aircraft optimized for the kind of maneuvering combat that air warfare theorists had predicted would dominate, who had training programs that produced pilots with hundreds of hours of flight time before they saw combat, and the Mitsubishi Zero had been revelation and nightmare, could outturn any Allied fighter, could climb faster, could fight at altitudes where American aircraft struggled, had range that allowed operations far beyond what American planners thought possible. And Japanese pilots used these advantages with tactical sophistication that came from experience and institutional knowledge built through years of combat operations. American pilots flying Wildcats and early model fighters tried to fight the way they'd been trained, tried to engage in turning combat where maneuverability mattered most, and discovered that Zero pilots could reverse any turn, could stay inside any circle, could position themselves for killing shots while American pilots burned energy trying to match maneuvers their aircraft couldn't execute, and losses mounted in ratios that were unsustainable, that threatened to destroy American naval air capability before the war was 6 months old, and these losses weren't due to cowardice or incompetence but to fighting enemy strengths with tactics that played to those strengths, to using aircraft that couldn't match Zero performance in the combat regime where Zeros were optimized, and the training imbalance was severe because Japanese pilots arrived at combat units with extensive preparation while American pilots were being rushed through abbreviated training to meet demand, were going into combat with minimal hours and no combat experience facing pilots who'd been fighting for years, and this experience gap compounded the tactical and equipment disadvantages to create situations where American casualties were high and Japanese casualties were minimal, and something had to change or American naval aviation would simply be ground down through attrition it couldn't sustain. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation approached the fighter design problem differently than Japanese engineers had approached it from fundamentally different assumptions about what determined success in naval aviation, and these different assumptions reflected different strategic situations and different philosophies about warfare. Where Japanese design prioritized individual aircraft performance and assumed that superior pilots and superior aircraft would win engagements, Grumman prioritized pilot survival and operational sustainability and assumed that wars were won by bringing experienced pilots back from missions to fly again, by maintaining numerical superiority through better logistics and production, by creating aircraft that could absorb damage and remain functional, and this philosophy manifested in the F6F Hellcat through design choices that Japanese engineers would have considered unacceptable compromises. The Hellcat was heavy because it incorporated armor plating around the pilot and vital systems, incorporated self-sealing fuel tanks that wouldn't explode when hit, incorporated redundant hydraulic and electrical systems so that battle damage wouldn't immediately disable the aircraft, and this protection added weight that reduced maneuverability but drastically improved survivability, meant that pilots who got shot, and pilots would get shot in combat, could often make it back to carriers rather than dying or being captured, and this survivability created compounding advantages because experienced pilots could train new pilots and could accumulate tactical knowledge and could become more effective with each mission they survived. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower, gave the Hellcat speed and climb rate that could match or exceed the Zero, gave pilots the ability to dictate engagement terms by choosing when to fight and when to disengage, and this power came with reliability that Japanese engines couldn't match, came with maintenance requirements that carrier crews could meet without specialized tools or extensive overhaul, came with production numbers that meant replacement engines were available when needed, rather than forcing aircraft to be cannibalized for parts. The 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, represented overwhelming firepower by Pacific theater standards, could destroy enemy aircraft with brief bursts, could penetrate Japanese aircraft structure that wasn't armored, could engage at ranges where lighter-armed aircraft couldn't be effective, and while these guns added weight and while their ammunition added more weight, the trade-off was that Hellcat pilots could kill quickly when they achieved firing position, could afford to take shots that pilots with lighter armament would have to pass up, could engage multiple targets in single missions because they carried enough ammunition, and this firepower advantage meant that when American pilots did get shooting opportunities they didn't waste them, didn't need perfect positioning, just needed adequate position and adequate aim, and Japanese aircraft would disintegrate under the hammering of 6.50 caliber streams. The tactical doctrine that evolved around the Hellcat represented fundamental reconceptualization of fighter combat, represented learning from early war losses and adapting to realities rather than trying to force reality to match pre-war theories, and this doctrine was summarized in advice that veteran pilots gave to newcomers: don't turn, dive. The Zero's advantage was maneuverability, was its ability to outturn any Allied fighter, and trying to compete in that regime meant fighting where Japanese advantages were maximum and American advantages were minimal, meant playing the enemy's game on the enemy's terms, but the Hellcat could do things the Zero couldn't, could dive faster because its heavier structure could handle higher speeds, could pull out of dives at lower altitudes because its stronger wings wouldn't fail under stress, could climb back to altitude using raw power that Japanese engines couldn't match, and American pilots learned to use altitude as their primary tactical advantage, learned to position above Japanese formations and attack from altitude with speed, learned to make one pass and then extend away using speed to escape, learned that if a Zero got on their tail the solution was to dive, to use weight and power to accelerate beyond what Zeros could follow, to reset the engagement from altitude rather than trying to turn fight, and this doctrine worked because it exploited Hellcat strengths while avoiding Zero strengths, worked because American pilots disciplined themselves to fly their aircraft's fight rather than their enemy's fight, and gradually confidence grew as pilots realized the Hellcat could absorb hits that would destroy Japanese aircraft, could take battle damage and still fly, could bring them home even when wounded, and this confidence translated into aggressiveness because pilots who trusted their aircraft's durability were willing to press attacks where pilots in fragile aircraft would break off, were willing to take risks that paid tactical dividends, were willing to stay in fights longer because they knew their aircraft could survive damage that would be fatal to opponents. The first combat encounters between Hellcats and Zeros occurred in late 1943 as American carriers began receiving the new fighters and as newly trained pilots brought tactical doctrine into practice against enemy formations that were accustomed to dictating engagement terms, that expected American fighters to either run or fight foolishly, and these early engagements established patterns that would persist through subsequent battles. Hellcat pilots resisted instinct to turn fight when Zero pilots tried to bait them into circling combat, instead used altitude and speed to make single passes and then extend, used teamwork where wingmen protected each other rather than each pilot. Fighting individually, used communication to coordinate attacks and to warn each other about threats, and Japanese pilots discovered that tactics which had worked against earlier American fighters didn't work against Hellcats because Hellcat pilots wouldn't take the bait, wouldn't commit to extended turning fights, wouldn't make the mistakes that earlier American pilots had made, and the Zero's legendary maneuverability became less relevant when American pilots refused to fight in the regime where that maneuverability mattered. More shocking to Japanese pilots was discovering that diving away, their traditional escape when situations became unfavorable, no longer worked because Hellcats could follow them down, could match or exceed their dive speed, could catch them before they could extend away, and this meant that Japanese pilots who got into unfavorable situations couldn't escape the way they'd been accustomed to escaping, couldn't rely on dive speed to reset engagements, were trapped in situations where American pilots held advantage and could maintain that advantage until they achieved killing position, and the psychological impact of this was significant because Japanese pilots had operated with confidence that they could always escape if necessary, that their superior maneuverability gave them options, and discovering that Hellcats had closed this escape route created uncertainty and caution where aggression had previously existed. The durability that Grumman had engineered into the Hellcat became apparent when Japanese pilots achieved hits and watched American aircraft continue flying, watched them absorb damage that would have destroyed Zeros, watched them return fire and maintain formation, and this created frustration and doubt because Japanese pilots were accustomed to seeing their opponents disintegrate or burn or fall apart when hit, were accustomed to their 20mm cannon and 7.7mm machine guns being adequate to destroy enemy aircraft, but Hellcats absorbed punishment and kept fighting, absorbed hits to wings and fuselage and tail, lost pieces and leaked fluids but continued to fly, and Japanese pilots began to realize that they were fighting an aircraft that was built differently, that reflected different priorities, that could survive battle damage through engineering rather than through avoiding damage, and this realization gradually undermined confidence as Japanese losses increased while American pilots who should have been dead kept surviving and returning to fight again. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in June 1944 was where all these advantages, tactical doctrine, aircraft capability, pilot training, industrial capacity, concentrated into a single battle that demonstrated how completely American naval aviation had reversed the Pacific Air War, had transformed from victim to predator in less than 2 years through systematic learning and adaptation and resource application. The battle developed as Japanese naval forces attempted to stop American invasion of Saipan, attempted to inflict carrier losses that would delay American advance across the Pacific, assembled carrier task forces, representing Japan's remaining naval air capability and launched massive strikes against American carrier groups operating near the Mariana Islands, and Japanese command believed that quantity and determination could overcome whatever tactical advantages Americans had developed, believed that pilots willing to die would ultimately defeat pilots who prioritized survival, believed that concentrated attacks would overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers, and these beliefs were wrong in ways that would become apparent within hours. American carrier task forces received radar warning of incoming Japanese strikes while those strikes were still over 100 miles distant, received warning that allowed defensive preparations that Japanese planners hadn't anticipated, allowed fighter controllers to vector Hellcat squadrons toward optimal interception positions, allowed American pilots to gain altitude before engagement, allowed tactical organization that meant Japanese strikes encountered coordinated defense rather than scattered reaction, and this radar-directed defense represented technological and tactical sophistication that Japanese forces couldn't match, represented integration of sensors and communications and command and control that Japanese doctrine hadn't anticipated, and the result was that Japanese strike packages flew into defenses that were ready and positioned and overwhelming. Hellcat squadrons launched in waves from multiple carriers, climbed to intercept altitude while ground controllers provided vectors toward inbound raids, achieved position where altitude and speed advantages were maximum, and began attacking Japanese formations that were still organizing, that were attempting to coordinate their own attacks, that were vulnerable because they'd been detected early and engaged before they could execute their plans, and the engagement became series of one-sided combats where American advantages in aircraft capability and pilot training and tactical doctrine all reinforced each other to create casualties that shocked even American participants. Japanese pilots in this battle were not the experienced veterans who'd fought early in the war. Most of those veterans were dead or had been transferred to training duties, but were replacement pilots with minimal training and no combat experience, pilots who'd been rushed through abbreviated programs because Japanese training capacity couldn't replace losses while maintaining quality, pilots who'd learned to take off and land and fly basic formations but who lacked the hundreds of hours of peacetime training that pre-war Japanese pilots had received, and these replacement pilots encountered Hellcat pilots who were systematically trained, who'd learned tactical doctrine in training that replicated combat conditions, who had advantages in aircraft capability that their training had taught them to exploit, and the result was slaughter where Japanese pilots died without achieving anything, where their attacks disintegrated before reaching targets, where American pilots described the engagement as resembling shooting turkeys, hence the name Turkey Shoot that would stick with the battle despite its official designation as the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The numbers from that single day in June 1944 documented the complete destruction of Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. 346 Japanese aircraft destroyed in combat, the vast majority falling to Hellcat squadrons that intercepted strikes before they reached American carriers, killed through combination of superior tactics and superior aircraft capability and superior pilot training, killed at ratios that demonstrated how completely the balance of air power had shifted, and only a handful of American aircraft lost despite Japanese pilots attempting desperate attacks, attempting to ram American ships when their attacks failed, attempting individual heroics that accomplished nothing against organized defense, and Japanese carriers that had launched those strikes could not regenerate their air groups, could not train replacement pilots fast enough to make up for losses, could not maintain operational capability without experienced aviators and functioning aircraft. And the battle effectively ended Japanese carrier aviation as a factor in the Pacific War, reduced Japanese naval air forces to defensive operations from land bases where they would continue to take losses but could not project power or contest American advances. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot demonstrated what the accumulated advantages of Hellcat design and American tactical doctrine and pilot training programs could achieve when concentrated against an enemy whose capabilities had degraded through attrition and whose doctrine hadn't adapted to changed circumstances, demonstrated that Japanese confidence in pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability couldn't overcome American advantages in durability and firepower and systematic tactical application, demonstrated that wars between industrial powers were won through sustainable systems rather than through individual brilliance, and while Japanese pilots fought with courage and determination and willingness to die, these qualities couldn't substitute for adequate training and capable aircraft and sound doctrine, couldn't reverse mathematics where American forces could replace losses faster than they occurred while Japanese forces could not replace losses at any rate that maintained capability. The 19-to-1 kill ratio that the Hellcat achieved over its combat career, 19 enemy aircraft destroyed for every Hellcat lost, represented not a single factor but the compounding effects of design philosophy and tactical doctrine and training systems and industrial capacity all working together. The Hellcat's durability meant more pilots survived missions and gained experience and became more effective over time, meant that American naval aviation developed institutional knowledge through veterans who could train new pilots rather than losing that knowledge when pilots died. The tactical doctrine that emphasized using Hellcat strengths rather than competing with zero strengths meant engagements happened on American terms more often than on Japanese terms, meant American pilots fought when advantages favored them and disengaged when they didn't. The training pipeline that produced pilots with systematic preparation rather than rushed qualification meant American pilot quality remained consistent even as numbers increased, meant replacement pilots arriving at combat units were adequately prepared rather than being cannon fodder. And American industrial capacity meant that aircraft losses could be replaced immediately while Japanese losses created permanent gaps, meant that spare parts and ammunition and fuel were available when needed while Japanese logistics struggled to maintain operations, meant that damaged aircraft could be repaired rather than being abandoned for lack of materials, and these compounding advantages created situations where Japanese forces were fighting with degraded capability against American forces operating at or near peak capability, where each engagement further widened the gap because American forces maintained strength while Japanese forces weakened, where the mathematical outcome became inevitable even when individual Japanese pilots fought skillfully and courageously, because individual skill couldn't overcome systemic disadvantage, couldn't reverse ratios where one side could sustain operations indefinitely and the other side was consuming irreplaceable resources with each mission flown. The aftermath of the Pacific Air War saw honest assessments from surviving Japanese pilots about what they'd faced and what they'd misunderstood, saw Saburo Sakai, who survived the war despite being shot down multiple times, acknowledge in post-war writings that American aircraft like the Hellcat had been underestimated, that Japanese doctrine had been rigid in ways that prevented adaptation, that American pilot training had produced consistent quality that Japanese training couldn't match as war progressed, that Japan's emphasis on individual pilot excellence had created vulnerabilities when those excellent pilots were lost and couldn't be replaced, and these acknowledgments reflected broader understanding that Japan had fought the wrong war with the wrong strategy against an opponent whose resources and systematic approach made defeat inevitable once initial Japanese advantages had been countered, and the Hellcat symbolized this shift more clearly than any other single weapon system, because it represented American industrial strength applied to tactical problems, represented learning from defeats and adapting systematically, represented prioritizing pilot survival over aircraft performance, represented understanding that wars were won by sustainable systems rather than by heroic individuals, and the fact that it had been mocked as too heavy and too ungainly and too American-typical just made its success more definitive because it meant Japanese assumptions had been completely wrong, had been based on doctrines that didn't account for how industrial warfare actually worked, had assumed that tactics developed in earlier eras would remain valid when circumstances and opponents changed, and the Hellcat's 19-to-1 ratio stood as statistical evidence that modern warfare rewarded different qualities than traditional military thinking assumed, rewarded durability over elegance, rewarded systematic competence over individual brilliance, rewarded industrial capacity over tactical refinement, and while this understanding came too late to help Japanese military planners who'd committed to different assumptions, it became part of military historical knowledge about how industrial wars are won, about what factors determine outcomes when modern nations commit to total war, about how systematic advantages compound over time to create results that seem inevitable in retrospect but which were built through thousands of decisions about design and doctrine, and training that reflected fundamentally different philosophies about warfare. The Hellcat remained one of the most successful fighters in aviation history not because it was the most advanced or the most elegant or the most impressive in any single performance category, but because it was honest about what war demanded aircraft that could bring pilots home, demanded tactical doctrine that exploited strengths rather than competing with enemy strengths, demanded training programs that produced consistent competence, demanded logistics and maintenance that could sustain operations, demanded design choices that prioritized survival over performance, and these demands were met through unglamorous engineering and systematic execution and institutional learning from failure, through Grumman engineers choosing armor over agility, through Navy tactical developers creating doctrine that acknowledged aircraft limitations and worked within them, through training commands building programs that produced pilots who could execute doctrine rather than freelance, through maintenance crews keeping aircraft flying through reliable engineering rather than through constant improvisation, and the men who flew Hellcats understood this even if they couldn't always articulate it, understood that they were fighting an aircraft that had been designed to keep them alive, that their survival mattered to people who'd never met them, that the heaviness that made the Hellcat less graceful than enemy fighters was weight that would stop bullets and bring them home, and this understanding created trust between pilots and aircraft that manifested in willingness to press attacks and to stay in fights and to take risks that paid tactical dividends, trust that pilots and fragile aircraft couldn't have, trust that came from engineering rather than from speeches or inspiration, trust that was earned through design choices that prioritized pilot survival over aesthetic elegance or doctrinal purity, and this trust was rewarded statistically through survival rates that meant Hellcat pilots who made it through their first few missions were likely to survive their tours, were likely to go home and see families and live lives, and this survival was victory more meaningful than kill ratios, more important than tactical successes, more valuable than any combat achievement, because survival meant these pilots could teach next generations about what they'd learned, could pass forward institutional knowledge, could contribute to post-war society, could become the veterans whose experience would shape American understanding of the war, and the Hellcat brought them home not through being the best fighter in any absolute sense but through being honest about what mattered and what didn't, about what could be sacrificed and what couldn't, about what war actually required rather than what peacetime theorists thought it required, and that honesty, That recognition that pilot survival trumped aircraft performance, that sustainable systems beat heroic gestures, that industrial capacity was strategic advantage, was wisdom that came from learning through failure and adapting through necessity and committing to what worked rather than to what seemed impressive. And the Hellcat embodied this wisdom in riveted aluminum and armored steel and 6.50 caliber machine guns, embodied it in ways that earned 19-to-1 kill ratio and earned the trust of pilots who flew it and earned place in history as the aircraft that broke Japanese naval aviation through, being exactly what it needed to be. Durable enough to survive, powerful enough to dictate terms, deadly enough to kill efficiently, and reliable enough to bring its pilots home, mission after mission, battle after battle, until the war was won not through dramatic victories but through accumulated advantages that industrial strength and systematic competence created when applied by people who understood that war demanded honesty about priorities rather than attachment to elegant theories, demanded choosing what worked over what looked impressive, demanded bringing pilots home over achieving performance specifications, and the Hellcat did exactly this, did it with unglamorous effectiveness that sometimes disappointed pilots expecting glamorous fighters but which kept them alive to complain about it, kept them alive to go home, kept them alive to remember when they were old men that the heavy, graceless fighter they'd flown in youth had been the aircraft that saved their lives through nothing more complex than good engineering and honest priorities and the recognition that in war, beauty is irrelevant but survival is everything, and the men who flew Hellcats home from combat over the Pacific carried that understanding forward, carried it into peacetime where it shaped how they thought about sacrifice and duty and what mattered, carried it into old age where they could look back and recognize that the joke plane that Japanese pilots had mocked had been exactly what American naval aviation needed, exactly when it was needed, built by people who understood war better than theorists did, flown by pilots who learned to trust unglamorous competence over impressive capability, maintained by crews who kept them flying through reliable design, and that this combination, honest engineering, learned doctrine, systematic training, industrial capacity, had shattered Japanese naval aviation not through dramatic dogfights, but through accumulated attrition where every loss Americans suffered could be replaced while every loss Japanese suffered was permanent, where the joke plane proved more lethal than elegant enemies because lethality came from bringing pilots back to fight again, came from durability that absorbed damage, came from firepower that killed quickly, came from speed that dictated engagement terms, came from all the unglamorous practical choices that Grumman engineers had made when designing an aircraft to win a war rather than to win airshows, and history validated those choices through statistics and through survival rates and through the fact that when the war ended, American naval aviation had destroyed Japanese naval aviation utterly while retaining capability to continue operations indefinitely, and the Hellcat was symbol and instrument of this transformation, was proof that modern warfare rewarded different virtues than traditional military thinking assumed, was evidence that, in industrial conflicts between modern nations, the side that learned faster and adapted better and prioritized sustainability over glory would prevail regardless of initial advantages or traditional martial values. And this lesson, learned at terrible cost by Japanese pilots who were brave and skilled but whose doctrine and equipment reflected assumptions that industrial warfare had made obsolete, remained relevant long after the Hellcat itself retired, remained part of military wisdom about how wars are won, about what factors determine outcomes, about why honesty about priorities matters more than commitment to traditions, and the F6F Hellcat, joke plane and flying truck and unglamorous workhorse, earned its place in history through the simplest possible metric. It won, it brought pilots home, it did what war demanded without pretending war was something other than what it was, and that honesty, that refusal to romanticize or beautify or pretend that anything mattered more than pilot survival and mission success, was perhaps the greatest tribute that could be paid to the aircraft and to the men who designed it and the men who flew it and the men who maintained it, because it acknowledged that they understood what mattered, understood what war cost, understood what victory required, and built and flew and maintained exactly what was needed, nothing more elegant than necessary, nothing less effective than required, just honest capability applied systematically until the war was won and pilots came home.